A cold dread stirs in the forgotten pits of Angband. The elf lord Glorfindel, a being of ancient power and light, feels this disturbance deep within the fabric of the world itself. It is a whisper of a forgotten evil, a shadow that should have remained buried. This is the story of the first dragon of Arda, Morgoth's greatest weapon, and the catastrophic war its awakening would unleash. By the end, you will understand the true, terrifying cost of victory against an unstoppable evil. What ancient power could make even the elves feel such primal fear, and what single decision would set a tragic chain of events into motion that would doom heroes and kingdoms alike. Where are you listening from right now, and what is the local time where you are? What does true sacrifice look like when the fate of a world hangs in the balance? The polished stone of the council chamber felt cold beneath Glorfindel's hands. He stood before Gil-galad, the High King of the Elves, and spoke not of whispers or vague feelings, but of a tangible dread seeping from the northern mountains. He described a shadow that drank the light, a presence so ancient and vile, it could only be one of Morgoth's forgotten horrors, stirring from its long slumber. His plea was direct. He needed warriors, an elite company to venture into the blighted wastes and confirm the threat before it could fully awaken. Gil-galad listened, his regal face a mask of thoughtful concern. The memory of the last great war was a fresh scar upon the elves, and the realm's defenses were stretched thin. To commit more of his strength to a scout based on a feeling, however powerful that feeling was, seemed a dangerous gamble. Yet he could not ignore the light of certainty in Glorfindel's eyes, a light that had faced a Balrog and lived. With a heavy heart, the king granted the request, but the contingent was small, far smaller than Glorfindel had hoped. The decision sent ripples of discontent through the king's advisors. Some saw it as wisdom, others as reckless folly, straining the fragile political unity of the realm. Glorfindel felt the weight of their doubt, a pressure as tangible as the armor he wore. His duty to his king warred with his absolute certainty of the peril. To argue further would border on insubordination. To do nothing would be a betrayal of all he was. So he made a choice that revealed his profound foresight. He would take the small, swift force and rely on stealth and speed rather than overwhelming strength. It was a decision that accepted immense personal risk, betting his life and the lives of his warriors on the hope that they could move unseen and learn the truth before it was too late. The mission was no longer a simple reconnaissance. Its success or failure now held the fate of an entire world in the balance. If they failed, this nascent evil would burst upon the elven kingdoms and all of Middle-earth utterly unprepared. As Glorfindel's company departed the last outpost under a blanket of sharp, clear stars, a low, unnatural rumble rolled down from the peaks of the Iron Mountains. It was not the sound of stone falling, but of something immense stirring in the deep dark, a grim promise of the fire and terror that lay ahead. The air itself tasted of ash and old ruin. Glorfindel led his small company across the Anfauglith, a vast and lifeless plain where no grass grew, only cracked earth and jagged stone. This was the scorched graveyard of the once green Ard Galen, a testament to Morgoth's enduring hatred. Every step was a struggle, the desolate landscape sapping their strength and clouding their spirits with a pervasive gloom. They moved like ghosts, avoiding the patrols of orcs whose distant cries echoed across the wastes, a constant reminder of the enemy's watchful eye. Fear began to whisper among the younger elves, their ancient light flickering against the oppressive shadow. They questioned the wisdom of pressing forward into such obvious peril, their resolve tested by the very ground beneath their feet. Glorfindel felt their wavering spirits, but his own purpose remained an unshakable pillar of light. He made the difficult choice to ignore their counsel for caution, driving them deeper into the heart of the desolation. The mission was all that mattered. Then they found the tracks. They were not the marks of any beast they knew. Colossal, serpentine grooves were carved into the hard ground, as if a mountain itself had begun to slither. The sheer scale of the impressions was enough to silence all doubt and replace it with a new, more primal terror. Their quest was no longer about investigating a feeling. It was now a hunt for a physical monster of unimaginable power. With grim determination, they followed the trail of shattered rock and upturned earth, a path of destruction that led their eyes toward the triple peaks of Thangorodrim, where the very air grew thick and heavy with a palpable malice. The trail of devastation ended at a jagged fissure in the mountainside, a wound in the earth that exhaled a foul, heated wind. It was a gateway, a forgotten passage into the roots of the Iron Mountains and the dreadful dungeons of Angband itself. Glorfindel stood before that opening, the light within him recoiling from the palpable evil that poured forth. To enter was to step into the very heart of the enemy's power, a decision that could not be unmade. With a final, silent look to his warriors, he made the choice and led them into the suffocating dark. The change was immediate and assaulting. The oppressive aura of the fortress was a physical weight, a spiritual poison that clouded their elven senses and clawed at their hope. The world narrowed to a claustrophobic labyrinth of rough-hewn tunnels, where every shadow seemed to writhe with malice. The external conflict of navigating this terrifying unknown was matched only by the internal conflict raging within each elf, a desperate struggle to resist the despair that sought to drown their inner light. In this environment, a single misstep, the faintest clink of armor, would spell their doom. Glorfindel made a critical tactical decision. He ordered absolute silence, commanding them to muffle their weapons and rely solely on stealth and the faint, controlled glow of their own spirits. This choice minimized their immediate profile, turning them into ghosts within the enemy's home, but it came at a grave cost. It left them vulnerable, their senses already blinded by the pervasive evil, now further hampered in the oppressive, all-consuming dark, where any horror could be lurking just beyond their dim light. They were no longer observers on a scout. They were intruders in the most fortified and wicked place in all the world. Discovery would not mean a battle. It would mean capture, torment, or a fate far worse than a clean death. The personal stakes for every member of the company were now absolute, their very souls hanging in the balance with every cautious step they took deeper into the maze. Then the stone beneath their feet began to tremble with a low, resonant thrumming, a rhythmic vibration that spoke of a great and terrible heart beating somewhere in the unimaginable deep below. The rhythmic thrumming grew into a deep, resonant shudder that vibrated up through their boots. Glorfindel motioned his warriors to a precarious ledge overlooking a chasm so vast its other side was lost in a heat-hazed gloom. Far below, in a cavern of unimaginable size, something moved. It was a sinuous shift of shadow and scale, a coiling immensity that scraped against pillars of raw rock with a sound like continents grinding together. A wave of dry, furnace-like heat washed over them, carrying a stench of sulfur and charred stone. This was no mere beast of shadow. This was the first dragon, a living weapon of fire and scale, a truth more terrible than any nightmare. A primal, gut-level terror seized the elves, a fear so ancient it felt written into their very souls. The legendary light of the Eldar, which had held fast against Balrogs, flickered in the face of this new and absolute evil. Their confidence, already strained by the oppressive fortress, shattered. How could any army, any blade, stand against such a creature? The internal conflict was immediate and brutal. Every instinct screamed for flight, to flee the suffocating dread of its presence. Yet their mission demanded they bear witness, to sear the horror of this sight into their memories, so the world above might be warned. The external conflict was even more perilous. A single loose stone, a stifled gasp, the faintest glimmer of their inner light reflected off a scale, and they would be discovered, consumed in an instant by an enemy they could not hope to challenge. Glorfindel, his own spirit reeling from the sight, made the only choice a true commander could. Valor here was suicide. Their deaths would serve no one, and the warning would die with them in the dark. He gave the signal, a sharp, silent gesture. They would withdraw. They would carry this terrible knowledge back to Gil-galad. This decision, to choose strategic wisdom over a glorious, futile end, was the ultimate test of his leadership. It showcased a profound understanding that the true battle was not for this cavern, but for the survival of their entire world. The stakes of their mission had just escalated beyond measure. The threat was no longer a suspicion. It was a quantified, breathing cataclysm waiting to be unleashed. The fate of every elf, every kingdom of Middle-earth, now rested entirely on their ability to navigate back through the labyrinth and escape Angband alive. Their retreat was no less perilous than their advance. It was a race against a doom they had just seen firsthand. As they turned from the ledge, moving with a new, desperate urgency, a grating roar erupted from the depths. It was not a sound of rage, but of alarm. The hunt for the intruders had begun. Grating horns and guttural roars erupted from the darkness behind them. The hunt was on. From side tunnels and fissures they had not even seen, orc packs poured forth, a tide of crude iron and hatred, but these were not alone. Among them moved darker, more fluid shapes, creatures of shadow and malice that seemed to drink the very light from the air. The elves were forced into a desperate, running battle, their graceful forms suddenly clumsy in the tight, twisting passages as they fought for every step back toward the surface. The first elf to fall was a young warrior named Kalan. A black-fletched arrow took him in the throat, and he fell without a sound. His death was a cold shock that hardened the resolve of his companions, even as it settled like a stone in Glorfindel's heart. This was the personal cost of his decision to enter the fortress, a burden of command that grew heavier with each life lost to the pursuing darkness. Externally, it was a frantic struggle for survival against overwhelming numbers. Internally, it was a war against a creeping despair, the terrifying knowledge that they were being hunted like animals in an endless, lightless maze. Glorfindel made a critical choice, one he repeated at every narrow pass and crumbling archway. He positioned himself as the rear guard, placing his own body between his warriors and the onslaught. He would plant his feet, and a brilliant, searing light would erupt from him, not as an attack, but as a shield. He forged barriers of pure, solidified radiance that scorched the advancing orcs and caused the shadow creatures to recoil with shrieks of pain. This decision saved his company, allowing them to gain precious distance, but it came at a terrible price. Each barrier drained him, dimming his inner fire and marking him as the primary target for the enemy's concentrated fury. The mission had completely transformed. It was no longer about stealth or secrecy. It was a raw, desperate race for survival. The stakes could not be higher. If they were caught and slain in these tunnels, their terrible knowledge would die with them. Morgoth's greatest weapon would emerge from the mountains to strike a world that was blissfully unaware, utterly unprepared for the fire and ruin that would follow. After what felt like an age of fighting and fleeing, a sliver of gray light appeared ahead. They burst from the mountainside, stumbling into the open air of the blighted plain, their lungs heaving in the sulphurous wind. But their relief was instantly shattered. Their path to the south, to safety and warning, was completely blocked. Standing between them and salvation was a new threat, one far more terrifying than the horde at their backs. The great gate of Angband groaned open, and from the shadows between the mountains, the first dragon emerged. He was Glaurung, the father of dragons, a creature of vast, coiling scale and molten fire. Though not yet grown to his full, world-ending might, he was a monster of impossible size, his armored form blotting out the bleak sky. His eyes were not mere pits of flame, but ancient, golden pools of a foul and cunning intelligence that fixed upon the elves, paralyzing them with a dread deeper than any fear of fang or claw. The company was trapped, a fragile island of light between the hordes at their backs and the living cataclysm before them. Annihilation was a certainty. Glaurung did not roar, he did not charge. He simply advanced, a slow, deliberate tide of scaled muscle, and with each step, a wave of psychic malice washed over the elves. It was a psychological assault, a fog of confusion and despair that whispered of their inevitable doom, sapping their will to raise a sword, to even hope. This was not a battle of strength, but of spirit. Glorfindel saw his warriors faltering, their minds unraveling under the dragon's gaze. To stand and fight was to die, and to die here would be the end of everything. In a moment of desperate, brilliant inspiration, he made his choice. He would not fight the dragon, he would outthink him. Focusing every shred of his remaining power, Glorfindel did not create a shield, but a star. He unleashed a flash of pure, blinding light, a silent detonation of radiance, so intense it seared the eyes of the orcs, and caused even Glaurung to recoil with a hiss of shock and pain. It was a momentary diversion, a precious sliver of chaos. He screamed a single command to his warriors: scatter, do not look back, run. This was the ultimate escalation. This was no longer a retreat. It was the first open confrontation with Morgoth's ultimate weapon, and its entire purpose was not victory, but survival. The fate of every elven kingdom now rested on the slim chance that even one of his warriors could escape this plane and carry the warning south. As the brilliant light faded, the world rushed back in, stained with the color of rage. Glaurung's furious roar shook the very foundations of the mountains, a sound of wounded pride and vengeful promise. The horde surged forward, but their focus, and the dragon's burning golden gaze, was now fixed on a single, defiant figure standing alone on the cracked plain. Glorfindel had drawn the beast's full attention, a beacon of light in the gathering dark. Glorfindel stood alone against the descending tide of scale and shadow. He knew he could not outrun the dragon, not with his warriors so close to the edge of the plain. His only path was to stand his ground, with a final, sweeping glance to ensure his company was scattering into the broken landscape. He turned and planted his feet on a narrow spur of rock that arched over a deep chasm. He would make his final stand here, on this natural bridge, and by them, the seconds they needed to vanish with their vital warning. The duel that followed was a spectacle of terrible beauty. Glorfindel's elven blade, a sliver of captured starlight, met Glaurung's iron-hard scales in a shower of sparks. Each parry and thrust was a testament to his sublime skill and courage, a dance of light against overwhelming mass. Yet every clash was also a stark, brutal display of his enemy's absolute superiority. His sword could not pierce the dragon's armored hide. The heat from Glaurung's smoldering flesh seared his skin, and the beast's foul intelligence mocked his every move. This was not a battle Glorfindel fought to win. It was a battle he fought to endure for just a few moments more, a supreme test of his power and spirit against a force of pure, world-breaking destruction. He realized that courage alone would not be enough. A direct assault was futile. His only chance to save his people lay not in defeating the monster, but in using the monster's own strength against it. He made the ultimate decision. Instead of aiming for a vulnerable spot, he began to strike at the rock bridge itself, focusing his blows near the base of the spur where they stood. He then turned and ran, not away from Glaurung, but along the length of the narrow arch, luring the enraged dragon to follow. Glaurung, consumed by fury at this insolent, shining pest, surged after him. His colossal weight, combined with Glorfindel's precise strikes, was too much for the ancient stone to bear. With a deafening crack, the bridge gave way. A cataclysm of falling rock and dust swallowed them both, dragon and elf lord, plunging into the darkness of the chasm below. In that final, selfless act, Glorfindel traded his life for the future of his people. His sacrifice was the pivotal moment that allowed the story of the dragon to be told, that gave Middle-earth a warning and a fighting chance. As the dust slowly settled, the only sound was the frantic, enraged thrashing of Glaurung from within the rubble, a clear signal that the threat was only contained, not defeated. A single, bloodied elf staggered from the blighted plain, his armor scarred, and his eyes hollow with a horror that words could not capture. He was the only one. He collapsed at the gates of the nearest outpost, his breath a ragged gasp as he delivered a broken report of the colossal, scaled horror and the blinding light of his lord's final stand. This was the first official account of Glaurung, the father of dragons, a name that would soon echo through every hall of power with the chill of absolute dread. The news did not just travel, it detonated. Shockwaves of disbelief and terror radiated from Gil-galad's court, shattering centuries of strategic thought in an instant. This was not a larger army of orcs or another Balrog to be dueled by a hero. This was an age of warfare they had never conceived, where entire legions could be rendered obsolete by a single, living cataclysm. The survivors, those few who had scattered and escaped, were racked with a profound internal conflict. Their grief for Glorfindel and their fallen comrades now poisoned by a searing guilt. They had lived because he had died. How does an army mourn a loss that is also a salvation? Externally, the leadership faced a crisis with no precedent. Their maps and battle plans were suddenly useless. Gil-galad, his face a mask of grim resolve, made a series of swift, monumental decisions. He immediately ordered the fortification of every border, the raising of new watchtowers, and the forging of arms on a scale not seen since the dagger Bragolach. More crucially, he dispatched his fastest riders to every corner of the world, to the hidden kingdoms of the dwarves and the fledgling realms of men. The message was simple and dire: unite or die. The political and military stakes were no longer about defending a single realm or winning a battle. This was now a global struggle for survival. A regional threat had escalated into a world-spanning conflict, forcing ancient and wary peoples to consider an alliance that had once seemed impossible. As the call to arms spread and armies began to muster across the lands, a new sound rose among them, a name spoken not with sorrow, but with fierce purpose. Glorfindel. His sacrifice became their rallying cry, a blazing standard of courage against the coming dark, and all eyes, from the highest elven tower to the most remote mannish village, turned with a fearful, fixed attention toward the north, waiting for the day the earth would shake once more and the dragon would break free. The war council felt more like a tomb than a hall of kings. Gil-galad sat at its head, the single, blood-stained report from the survivor resting on the table between them, a silent witness to the horror they all now faced. Around him, the gathered lords of the elven realms and the chieftains of the Edain, the race of men, argued in hushed, frantic tones. The report of Glorfindel's sacrifice and the sheer scale of the dragon was the grim foundation upon which every possible strategy was built and just as quickly shattered. Old alliances, once comfortable and distant, were now tested under the crushing weight of a shared doom. The Elves of Nargothrond, hidden in their secret caves, advocated for a war of stealth and attrition, while the proud lords of the Fallas, with their great fleets, spoke of blockades and naval assaults. The chieftains of men, their people newer to the world and more vulnerable, pushed for an immediate, overwhelming attack, their courage fueled by a desperate need to protect their fledgling homes. Fear was the third party at the table, and it sowed discord with every whispered doubt and tactical disagreement. How do you plan the defeat of a creature that can shatter armies with its breath and crush hope with its gaze? Each leader grappled with this terrifying reality internally, their public confidence warring with private visions of fire and ruin. The external conflict was a storm of clashing philosophies, a dangerous delay that played directly into the hands of their waiting enemy. It was Gil-galad who finally silenced the chamber with a single, decisive pronouncement. He would forge a grand alliance, a union of all free peoples. They would not wait to be hunted. They would gather the most massive host ever seen and march on the gates of Angband itself. This was not a cautious plan. It was a single, desperate gamble that committed the entirety of their strength, their very future, to one colossal battle. The stakes were no longer the defense of a single border or kingdom. The fate of the entire land of Beleriand was now the prize. Victory could break the power of Morgoth for an age, securing a future for elves and men alike. Defeat would mean more than lost lives. It would mean the utter extinction of their kingdoms and the eternal subjugation of all they held dear. As the council dispersed to muster their armies, a palpable tension settled over the land. While smiths worked day and night, and soldiers gathered from every corner, grim-faced scouts brought new reports from the northern wastes. The earth around the chasm where Glaurung had fallen was now hot to the touch, and the rhythmic, hateful thrumming from the depths was growing stronger, a clear sign that the dragon's imprisonment was nearing its violent end. Deep within the hidden forges of Gondolin, the air shimmered with more than heat. It hummed with purpose and a desperate hope. The elven smiths, their hearts heavy with the loss of Glorfindel, had taken his final act of light as their charge. They would forge a blade not just of metal, but of vengeance and salvation, a weapon capable of achieving what an entire army could not, piercing the impenetrable hide of the first dragon. This endeavor became the secret heart of the Alliance, a single, focused point for all their defiance. Yet it was a race against a clock they could not see. Every ring of the hammer was a moment stolen from the mustering armies. Every resource poured into this one artifact, a gamble that their defenses would hold long enough for it to be completed. The master smith, a venerable elf named Mieglin, felt this pressure as a physical weight. It was an internal conflict that haunted his every waking moment. Could his skill truly craft a thing of legend under the shadow of the world's ending? One night, faced with a design that was merely excellent but not extraordinary, he made a fateful decision. He ordered the bringing of his most precious hoard, the last ingot of Galvorn, a metal that had fallen from the heavens in an age long past, darker than obsidian and harder than diamond. And into its core, as the metal was folded and refolded, he channeled a sliver of the pure, untainted light that Glorfindel had wielded, a living radiance bound within the blade. This decision made the sword, which they named Dramborleg, a singular and irreplaceable weapon, a torch against the ultimate dark. The stakes of their labor were now absolute. The entire grand strategy of the Alliance, the lives of every soldier who would stand on the field, hinged on the success of this one creation. Without Dramborleg, their massive host would be little more than kindling before Glaurung's fire. When the moment came for the final quench, the smiths plunged the blazing metal not into water, but into a vat of enchanted dew gathered from the leaves of the two trees of Valinor. A searing white fire erupted, blinding in its intensity, illuminating the entire cavern with a light that had not been seen in Middle-earth for centuries. And as that supernatural light faded, a low, deep tremor ran through the stone floor, a shudder that carried not from their hammers, but from the distant north. The dragon was stirring. Its prison of fallen rock would not hold for much longer. The earth itself tore apart. With a roar that shattered mountains and a blast of incandescent fire, Glaurung erupted from his prison of fallen rock, no longer the immense horror Glorfindel had faced, but a being of perfected, world-ending majesty. His scales were plates of polished obsidian. His wings, when they unfurled, blotted out the sun, casting a moving eclipse of terror across the land. He did not merely emerge, he was unleashed, a general of ruin at the head of Morgoth's endless legions. The first to feel his wrath were the frontier settlements, the brave outposts of elves and men that dotted the northern marches. They were not conquered, they were erased. Glaurung's fire did not just burn, it melted stone and boiled rivers. His cunning was as destructive as his breath, his golden eyes seeing the weakness in every wall, the fear in every heart. He left behind not ruins, but glassy, smoking plains, a trail of absolute desolation that marched south with horrifying speed. News of this absolute destruction flew ahead of the horde, each report more terrible than the last. These were not the tales of scouts, but the screams of refugees who had witnessed the impossible. A new kind of fear began to seep into the ranks of the Grand Alliance, a cold, paralyzing dread. How do you stand firm when you hear an entire fortress was turned to slag in a single hour? The external threat of the army was now magnified 1,000-fold by the internal terror of the dragon. The allied commanders, faced with this avalanche of fire and steel, made a fateful choice. They would not let Glaurung pick their kingdoms apart, one by one. They would meet him on the open plains of Anfauglith, the very same desolation where Glorfindel had made his stand. It was a field where their vast numbers, their cavalry, and their phalanxes could be deployed to their fullest. But it was also a terrible gamble, a flat, featureless landscape that offered no protection, no high ground, nothing to shield them from the full, horrifying scope of the dragon's power. This decision transformed the conflict entirely. The war was no longer about defending borders. It was a single, colossal roll of the dice for the heart of Beleriand itself. Victory on this field could break Morgoth's advance and secure a generation of peace. Defeat would mean the end of the elven kingdoms and the enslavement of all men. As the two greatest hosts the world had ever seen began their final march toward one another, the northern horizon was stained a perpetual, sickly orange. The very air grew thick and heavy, tasting of ash and ozone, crackling with the anticipation of a battle that would decide the fate of an age. The sky above the Anfauglith was a tapestry of cold, distant stars, their silent light illuminating a scene of pure chaos. The Grand Alliance of Elves and Men met the horde of Angband in a cataclysm of steel and fury, a roaring, churning sea of combat that stretched from horizon to horizon. At the center of this maelstrom was Glaurung, a living fortress of scale and flame. He was not just a combatant, he was the battle's turning point. A single sweep of his tail could flatten an entire phalanx of spearmen. A gout of his fiery breath did not just kill soldiers, it vaporized them, leaving behind glassy craters and a stench of cooked meat and molten armor. The elegant, coordinated formations of the elves shattered against his overwhelming presence, while the raw courage of men broke upon the sheer, monstrous brutality of his being. This was no longer a battle of tactics, but a charnel house of survival. The external conflict was a deafening, disorienting storm of clashing swords, screams of the dying, and the dragon's world-shaking roars. Internally, every warrior fought a second, more intimate war against a primordial fear that threatened to unhinge their minds. To stand your ground when a creature of legend and nightmare turns its golden, intelligent gaze upon you was the ultimate test of will. The very land suffered with them. The earth churned into a bloody mire, the air so thick with smoke and ash that the stars began to wink out one by one. From a slight rise, Gil-galad watched his grand strategy unravel. His forces were being systematically dismantled. He knew then that conventional warfare was a death sentence. In that moment of supreme crisis, he made a fateful decision. He summoned a company of the most renowned warriors, each a legend in their own right, and placed the newly forged blade, Dramborleg, into their leader's hands. Their mission was a near-suicidal strike, a single, focused lunge at the heart of the storm. They were to break through the chaotic press of the enemy, bypass the main horde, and engage the dragon directly. The fate of the entire alliance, the future of Beleriand itself, now hinged on this one desperate gambit and the edge of a single, shining blade. As the elite warriors charged down the slope and into the inferno, they became a sliver of hope, moving against a tide of absolute despair. Their path was not a clear line, but a violent carving through ranks of orcs and darker things, each step bought with blood and fierce determination. All the while, the colossal form of Glaurung loomed ahead, wreathed in smoke and flame, a living mountain of hatred that seemed to grow larger with every desperate stride they took. The elven champion moved like a shard of lightning across the broken ground, the blade Dramborleg a sliver of contained starlight in his hands. Glaurung's head swung down, a mountain of malice with jaws wide enough to swallow a house, and a torrent of liquid fire erupted forth. The champion did not stand and block. He flowed, his every instinct screaming as he dove and rolled, the heat searing the air where he had stood a heartbeat before, turning the very stone to bubbling glass. This was not a fight of brute force, but a deadly dance of impossible agility against overwhelming power. The lashing tail, a whip of armored muscle, carved a furrow through the earth, and again the champion was not there, his leap carrying him over the devastating swing. He was a mote of defiance, his courage a fragile shield against a being that could end him with a single touch. His only goal was to find a weakness, a single gap in the obsidian scales that encased the dragon's underbelly, a target no larger than a man's hand. Then he saw it, as Glaurung reared up to loose another blast of flame. The scaled plates near his chest stretched apart for a single, fleeting moment, revealing the softer, pale flesh beneath. It was the opening he had gambled his life for. With a final, explosive surge of speed, the champion closed the distance and drove the point of Dramborleg upward with all his strength. The enchanted blade, forged with the light of the two trees and the memory of Glorfindel's sacrifice, did not simply pierce the hide. It slid into the dragon's flesh as if it were returning home. A shriek tore from Glaurung's throat, a sound not of mere pain, but of profound, world-shaking shock. No weapon had ever bitten so deep. For the first time in his long, terrible existence, the father of dragons felt the cold kiss of true mortality. In that instant, the champion faced a choice. He could withdraw the blade and retreat, living to fight another day with the dragon wounded, or he could press his advantage, twisting the sword to carve a mortal wound from within. He chose the latter, a decision of absolute, selfless courage. He planted his feet, his muscles straining as he savagely turned the hilt, seeking to tear the dragon's vitals. He stood his ground within the shadow of the thrashing beast, a breath away from those rending claws and dagger-like teeth, because he knew this single act could shatter the enemy's spirit and turn the tide of the entire war. The fate of the Alliance, the future of every free kingdom, hung on the edge of that blade. His success would mean victory, snatched from the jaws of annihilation. His failure would mean the loss of their one hope and the death of their greatest hero. But a wounded god is at its most dangerous. The shock of the injury vanished, replaced by a rage so pure it seemed to still the very air. Glaurung's golden eyes, blazing with an ancient, hateful intelligence, locked onto the tiny figure clinging to the sword in his belly. His retaliatory strike was not a blind thrashing. It was a calculated act of vengeance. He did not bite or claw. He simply exhaled, and a cone of incandescent fury, hotter than the heart of a forge, engulfed the champion completely. A terrible silence fell upon the plain. The champion was gone, utterly consumed, and the blade Dramborleg was lost with him, buried somewhere within the smoldering ruin of the battlefield. But his sacrifice had not been in vain. That single, deep wound had broken the dragon's invincible aura. Seeing Glaurung falter, bleeding ichor of shadow and fire, Gil-galad seized the moment. He raised his own spear, Eglos, and a great cry went up from the elven host. They rallied, their grief and rage forging a new, desperate strength, and surged forward against the leaderless orc legions, which now crumbled into a panicked, disorganized mob. The battle turned from a slaughter into a rout. Forced to retreat, a wounded and infuriated Glaurung unleashed one final, spiteful blast of flame to cover his withdrawal, then turned his vast bulk and slithered back towards the dark safety of Angband, his hateful golden eyes promising a return. The Alliance held the field, but the cost was beyond calculation. They had achieved a victory, but it was a Pyrrhic one, a triumph that felt indistinguishable from defeat. The land itself was a charnel house, scarred by fire and soaked with the blood of countless elves and men. Their armies were decimated, their finest heroes lay among the slain, and they had lost the one weapon, forged specifically to kill the dragon. The external conflict of the battle was over, but an internal one now began, a profound struggle with grief and the hollow emptiness of a victory bought with such horrific loss. How does an army celebrate when its greatest champion is ash and its future seems so fragile? Gil-galad, his armor dented and his face etched with a weariness that went beyond years, walked among the fallen. He saw the cost in the eyes of his surviving soldiers, a mix of relief and trauma. He made the only decision a true king could. He ordered the fortification of their current position, a defensive line along the edges of the scorched plain. There would be no triumphant pursuit into the north, no reckless charge into the tunnels of Angband. He recognized that his forces were spent, their spirit broken even as their bodies still stood. To push their advantage now would be to deliver their exhausted remnant directly into Morgoth's waiting traps, ensuring total annihilation. The strategic stakes of the entire war had irrevocably shifted. They had proven a crucial, world-altering fact, that the dragon was not a god, that he could be wounded and forced to retreat. But the price of that lesson was seared into their memory. This was no longer a war of grand offensives and decisive battles. It settled instead into a long, grueling siege, a war of attrition against an enemy who could afford to wait in the dark, nursing his greatest weapon back to full strength. As the allies tended their wounds and buried their dead in mass graves beneath the cold stars, a single, chilling knowledge lay over their hard-won peace. Glaurung still lived. His malevolent presence was a shadow that stretched from the Iron Mountains, a constant reminder that their victory was only a temporary stay of execution, and that the next time the dragon emerged, he would bring a wrath as boundless as the deep places of the earth. The taste of victory turned to ash in their mouths. Glaurung did not return with thunder and fire, but with a serpent's patience. His body healed, but his pride remained a festering wound, and his vengeance took a new, more insidious form. He abandoned grand battles, becoming a phantom of terror that struck without warning. One day, a remote elven farming village would vanish, its wooden halls not burned, but crushed into splinters, the earth around them churned as if by a gigantic plow. The next, a crucial supply convoy from the dwarven mines would simply disappear, leaving only shattered wagons and a lingering stench of sulfur on the wind. This was not a war of armies, but a systematic campaign of psychological torment aimed at the very spirit of the free peoples. The external conflict had vanished from the open field, only to reappear as a knife in the dark, severing the fragile threads of trade and communication that held the alliance together. Fear became a permanent resident in every heart. The simple act of traveling between towns became a gamble with death. Farmers feared to tend their fields, and miners hesitated to descend into the earth, their morale crumbling under the constant, gnawing anxiety. The land itself, once a source of life and sustenance, was now a place of unseen menace. How do you plan for a harvest when a dragon might slither from the woods at dusk? This internal conflict, the slow erosion of hope, and the rise of paralyzing dread, was Glaurung's true weapon. He was no longer just a monster, he was a specter of despair, proving that cunning could achieve what raw power had not. Faced with this shadow war, the Alliance leadership, led by a weary Gil-galad, made a critical strategic shift. They could not muster another grand host to chase a ghost. Instead, they decided to fight fire with precision. They authorized the creation of small, highly mobile units, hunter knights, drawn from the most skilled trackers and resilient warriors of both elves and men. Their mission was not to slay the dragon, a task they knew was beyond them for now, but to become a protective screen for the populace. They would track Glaurung's movements, warn settlements of his approach, and harry him wherever possible, a desperate attempt to regain some measure of control over their own lands. This decision was a stark admission of their weakness, a defensive posture that conceded the initiative to their enemy. The stakes were no longer about winning a glorious war, but about simple survival. It was a slow, grinding contest of endurance, a test to see whether the kingdoms of the free peoples would perish not in a blaze of glory, but from 1,000 small, bleeding cuts, their strength and will sapped away until nothing remained. In this grim new chapter, a different kind of hero began to emerge from the ranks of these hunter knights. He was not an elf lord of ancient lineage, but a man of the House of Hador, a warrior named Húrin. He possessed a dour, unyielding determination that seemed forged in the very fires of the conflict itself. While others despaired at the unpredictability of their foe, Húrin studied the patterns in the chaos, the subtle signs others missed. He learned to read the language of the broken earth and the terrified accounts of survivors, piecing together a map of the dragon's cruel mind. His name began to pass from lip to lip in the besieged villages, not with the awe reserved for elven lords, but with a gritty, hard-won respect. He was a man who refused to bow to the shadow, a stubborn flame in the growing dark. Húrin stood as a bulwark where others faltered. He was not a king of elves, but a chieftain of the Edain, a man whose will was hardened in the fires of relentless conflict. When Glaurung's spawn, younger dragons of lesser might but terrible cunning, slithered from the mountains to burn a village, Húrin was there. He did not command from a distant tent, but fought in the front line, his great axe hewing through scale and sinew with a strength that seemed almost superhuman. His legend was not born from a single song, but from 100 small, desperate battles where his courage turned the tide. He defended a narrow pass for a day and a night alone, allowing a column of refugees to escape. He led a charge into a burning forest to rescue children trapped by orcs, emerging from the smoke with his armor scorched and his eyes burning with a grim light. Each feat was a story told and retold, a spark of hope in the deepening gloom. His people, the men of Dor Laman, began to see in him more than a leader. He became a living symbol of their resilience, a testament that humanity would not break, no matter how long the shadow grew. This respect soon transcended the race of men. Elven lords, who had once viewed mortals with a certain detached pity, now looked upon Húrin with a deep and genuine admiration. In the war councils, his voice carried a new weight, his blunt, practical insights offering a crucial perspective that complemented the high strategies of the Eldar. He was no longer just an ally, he was a key military leader in the Alliance. Yet this rise came at a profound personal cost. The burden of leadership was a heavy mantle. Every victory was tempered by the memory of losses, of faces he would never see again, of friends who fell defending a line he had ordered them to hold. The external conflict of constant battle was mirrored by an internal war, a silent struggle with the grief that threatened to consume him from within. He carried the weight of every life lost under his command, and the fear for his own family, his wife Morwen, and his young son Túrin, hidden away in his homeland, was a constant, sharp ache in his heart. It was in the wake of a particularly brutal skirmish, standing amidst the pyres of the slain, that Húrin made the decision that would define his destiny. He lifted his bloodied axe to the storm-racked sky and swore a terrible, unbreakable oath. He would dedicate his life and the strength of his entire house to the unending war against Morgoth. This was no mere promise of continued service. It was a vow of personal vendetta, a binding of his family's fate to the ultimate struggle against the Dark Lord. This single act escalated the entire war. The fate of men was now inextricably linked to the conflict, not just as soldiers, but as a people with a champion whose hatred for the enemy was as deep as the foundations of the world. Húrin's unwavering defiance could not go unnoticed. In the deepest pits of Angband, a malice older than the sun took note of the mortal who dared to stand so tall. Such pure, unbending spirit was a rarity, and to the Dark Lord, it represented a prize to be captured, not just a foe to be slain. A specific, cruel trap was laid, not in the open field, but in the treacherous shadow of the enemy's own walls, designed to exploit the very courage that made Húrin a legend. The false intelligence was a masterpiece of deception, a whisper of a weakly defended pass that promised a swift, decisive victory. Húrin, bound by his oath and driven by duty, led his warriors into the steep, shadowed canyon. But the moment they were fully committed within the narrow defile, the trap was sprung. From the high cliffs on either side, a sea of orcs revealed itself, their crude horns blaring a mocking fanfare. And there, coiled at the far end of the pass, blocking any hope of retreat, was Glaurung himself. His immense form filled the canyon, his golden eyes gleaming with a cold, satisfied intelligence. This was not a battle, it was an execution. The conflict was brutally one-sided, a storm of black-fletched arrows and grinding numbers against which even the mightiest courage could only hold for so long. Húrin fought with the strength of doomed valor, his axe a blur, his name a battle cry on the lips of his men as they fell one by one around him. The external fight against the endless horde was matched by an internal, psychological war against the crushing despair of betrayal. He had led his most loyal warriors to their deaths, and the weight of that failure was a poison more bitter than any wound. Yet even as the last of his company fell, Húrin made a choice. He would not grant them the satisfaction of a clean death in battle. He stood alone, covered in the blood of his friends, and defied the dragon to his face. He was overwhelmed not by skill, but by the sheer mass of bodies that piled upon him, pinning him alive. Dragged before the contemptuous gaze of Glaurung, Húrin made his final, defining decision. He would not bow, he would not beg. He offered no information, no plea, not even a word of surrender. His silence was a wall of defiance, his unbroken stare a rejection of Morgoth's entire dominion. This absolute refusal to acknowledge his captor's power sealed his terrible fate, but it preserved the one thing the Dark Lord could not take, his honor. The capture of their greatest human hero was a seismic blow to the alliance. Morale, already frayed by the long shadow war, crumbled. For Húrin's family, it was the beginning of a personal apocalypse. As he was dragged in chains toward the endless dark of Angband, a curse was woven around him and his bloodline, a spell of malice ensuring that his suffering would be long, his legacy one of sorrow, and that the shadow of his capture would stretch far beyond the walls of his prison. High in the stony silence of Thangaradrim, a single chair was set against the naked rock, facing south. Here, Húrin was bound not by iron, but by a spell of seeing, a cruel magic that granted him a perfect, unblinking view of the lands he had sworn to protect. Morgoth himself, a presence of suffocating shadow, laid the curse not with a shout, but with a cold, deliberate pronouncement. He swore that every venture of Húrin's bloodline would be poisoned, every hope would curdle into despair, and every act of love would sow the seeds of ruin. Húrin's punishment was not torment of the flesh, but of the spirit. He was made the eternal witness to the unraveling of his own family. His defiance became a silent, agonizing vigil. He could not close his eyes. He could not look away as the tendrils of the curse slithered southward toward his home in Hithlum, toward his wife Morwen and his young son, Túrin. The great war of armies and dragons had suddenly collapsed into this single, intimate tragedy. The conflict was no longer on a battlefield, but within the soul of one man, a relentless internal war against a grief that sought to shatter his mind. His only remaining weapon was his will, his decision to endure without breaking, to deny Morgoth the victory of his tears. This transformed his prison from a place of punishment into a throne of resistance, a silent bastion where the flame of a single, unyielding spirit still burned. The stakes escalated from the fate of kingdoms to the sanctity of the human heart itself. Could hope survive when the universe itself seemed bent on its destruction? Far below, in the misty valleys of Hithlum, a shadow that no eye could see fell upon the House of Húrin. His son, Túrin, a boy whose heart was already filled with the fierce pride of his father, felt a chill he could not name, a restlessness that would soon set him on a path of glory and profound sorrow. The mists of Hithlum, could not shelter the son of Húrin for long. Túrin, a boy bearing the heavy name of a captured hero, was sent away by his grieving mother Morwen, a desperate act to place him beyond the reach of Morgoth's vengeance. He found sanctuary in the hidden elven kingdom of Doriath, a realm of timeless beauty and grace. Under the wise gaze of King Thingol, Túrin should have grown into a lord of great renown. He learned the arts of war and counsel, his strength and skill surpassing even many of the Eldar, but the curse was a seed planted deep within his spirit, a thorn of pride and anger that twisted his noble heart. A bitter quarrel, born of a perceived slight, led him to make a fateful choice. He would not apologize or seek reconciliation. He chose exile, turning his back on the one place that offered true safety, believing that his honor demanded he walk his own path alone in the wild. That path was one of fire and blood. He became a leader of men, first among a band of outlaws, then as a captain in a border fortress. His name became a legend whispered by both friend and foe, a scourge to the orcs of Morgoth. He fought with a fury that seemed divine, his sword clearing entire fields of the enemy. Yet every triumph was shadowed by sorrow. A victory would be followed by the betrayal of a trusted lieutenant. A hard-won sanctuary would be overrun days after he secured it. The external conflict was a relentless grind against orcs, treacherous weather, and the petty jealousies of lesser men. But the internal war was far more devastating. Túrin carried the weight of his father's fate like a millstone, his pride constantly clashing with his deep-seated fear that he, too, was destined for a tragic end. This drove him to acts of reckless bravery, but also to a stubbornness that blinded him to wiser counsel. His decisions, always made from a place of fierce integrity, consistently played into the curse's cruel design. When a friend was wronged, Túrin chose swift and absolute vengeance, unleashing a cycle of violence that destroyed any chance of peace. When offered a chance to retreat and save his people, he chose to stand and fight, resulting in a glorious last stand that also meant the deaths of every soul under his command. He was a hero in the grandest, most tragic sense. His every virtue turned against him. The stakes of his personal war escalated with each passing year. He was no longer just a warrior fighting orcs. He was a focal point of the curse, a microcosm of the entire struggle against Morgoth. His failures were not his alone. They were catastrophes that doomed the communities and armies that looked to him for leadership, scattering hope and strengthening the very shadow he sought to defeat. And so this doomed hero, leaving a trail of shattered alliances and burned bridges across the land, found his steps turning ever northward. His quest for a place to belong, for a cause worthy of his sword, became a pilgrimage toward the source of all his grief. He was drawn, as if by a malevolent tide, back toward the blighted regions where the great serpent himself held sway. The dragon, the architect of his father's torment, and the symbol of his family's curse, was waiting. The hidden stone city of Nargothrond was no longer a secret. Túrin, now a lord of influence, had convinced its people that stealth was the strategy of mice. He argued for open defiance, for grand armies and a bridge across the river that served as their primary defense, a bridge that would allow their might to march forth and meet the enemy in the field. His words were persuasive, born of a warrior's pride and a deep-seated hatred for the shadow that had taken his father. The elves, weary of hiding, listened and built. They raised a great stone bridge and sent their soldiers out into the light, a proud host gleaming in the sun. But every march, every victory, was a beacon, drawing the gaze of the one enemy who craved such a target. Glaurung had been waiting. The dragon did not simply attack. He studied. He watched the new bridge, the mustering of soldiers, and he saw not a challenge, but a flaw. When his hour came, he led a vast host from Angband, not with a reckless charge, but with the chilling precision of a general who had already won the war in his mind. The Elves of Nargothrond, trained for open battle on Túrin's council, met the horde on the field before their gates. It was a slaughter. The orc legions were a distraction, a hammer to pin the elven army in place while the true weapon struck. Glaurung, immense and terrible, ignored the struggling soldiers. He marched directly for the great bridge, the very symbol of Nargothrond's new pride, and crossed it without a pause. The river, their ancient guardian, was now a path for their doom. The mighty doors of the city, built to withstand a siege, were shattered by his bulk and his fire. The sack was swift and merciless. King Orodreth fell defending his halls. The glorious underground city, a marvel of elven craft, became a tomb filled with smoke and screams, its people scattered or taken as slaves. Túrin fought like a demon, but he was a general watching his own strategy unravel into absolute ruin. The external destruction of the kingdom was mirrored by the complete collapse of his spirit. The truth was a blade in his heart, sharper than any orc spear. His counsel, his proud defiance, had built the very road that led the dragon to their doorstep. In the chaotic, smoke-choked tunnels, he was faced with an impossible choice. He heard the voice of Glaurung, a psychic whisper that coiled through the ruins, a taunt that named him the real destroyer of Nargothrond. And he heard the cries of the elven maiden Finduilas, his friend, being dragged away by the retreating orcs. He could turn and face the dragon, a final, suicidal act of vengeance. Or he could save one life amidst the thousands he had doomed. In a moment of agonizing compassion, Túrin made his decision. He turned his back on Glaurung and raced after the captors, choosing to rescue Finduilas. It was a choice born of love and a desperate need for redemption, but it was a choice the dragon had anticipated. By prioritizing a single life, Túrin allowed Glaurung to solidify his victory unchallenged, to despoil the city at his leisure and escape back into the north, his legend of terror now complete. The fall of Nargothrond was more than the loss of a kingdom. It was a demonstration that Morgoth's greatest weapon could shatter not just walls, but the very wisdom of his enemies, turning their strengths into fatal weaknesses. As Túrin emerged from the caves into the desolate light, the screams of the captured Finduilas fading into the distance, a cold fire ignited within him. All other purposes, all other loyalties, turned to ash. There was only one thing left in the world that mattered. He would find the dragon. The air over Cave Daenerys was thick and still, heavy with the stench of a glutted predator. There, coiled in the deep ravine like a river of obsidian scales, lay Glaurung. His great sides rose and fell in the rhythm of a deep, sated sleep. The fires within him banked after the destruction of Nargothrond. For Túrin, this was the moment. All the years of exile, all the lost battles and fallen friends, narrowed to this single point of vengeance. The external conflict was simple and absolute, a man against a monster. But the internal war was a storm of a lifetime of rage and sorrow, all focused into the cold, heavy weight of the black sword Gurthang in his hand. His decision was one of pure, desperate courage. He would not attack from a distance. He would crawl beneath the colossal, sleeping form, into the suffocating heat and the terrifying proximity of those iron scales, and strike upward into the one place the beast was vulnerable. It was a tactic that accepted a horrific death, for a dying god is a thrashing, collapsing mountain of flesh. But Túrin had nothing left to lose. The fate of his entire house, the meaning of his father's long defiance, the very soul of his family's honor, rested on the edge of that blade. He moved like a shadow, his breath held, every sense screaming as he slid into the perilous space between the dragon's belly and the earth. With a final, savage cry that was all the pain of his life given voice, he drove Gurthang upward into the soft flesh. The sword, hungry for this destiny, slid deep. A shudder racked the immense form, and a gout of black blood, hot and corrosive, drenched Túrin. Glaurung's golden eyes flew open, not with rage, but with a shocking, intelligent pain. He reared back, his death throes beginning to shake the very walls of the ravine. But as his life fled, the dragon's malice did not. He fixed his gaze on Túrin, and with his last, rattling breath, he did not roar. He spoke, his voice a psychic poison, seeping into Túrin's mind. He whispered of Túrin's sister, Niner, a name he had not heard in years. He spoke not of her location, but of her fate, weaving a final, venomous lie about a love that was not love, a union that was the deepest shame. Then the great light in his eyes went out, and Glaurung, the father of dragons, was still. The victory was absolute. The great beast was slain. But as the silence returned to Cave Denaras, Túrin stood frozen, the dragon's last words echoing in his skull, a seed of unimaginable horror, taking root in the ashes of his hard-won vengeance. The dragon's final whisper was not a roar, but a poison that seeped into the very foundations of Túrin's being. The name Niner, his sister lost in the chaos of his youth, hung in the air, and then Glaurung wove his last, most perfect illusion. He showed Túrin the truth, stripping away the veil of forgetfulness he had himself cast upon Niner's mind. The woman Túrin knew as Ninjal, his gentle wife, who had healed his wounds and shared his lonely life, was not who she seemed. She was his own sister, and their marriage, his one refuge of love and peace, was a monstrous deception crafted by the dragon's will. The victory was suddenly a hollow, screaming void. The external foe was slain, but the internal enemy, the curse, had just claimed its most terrible triumph. Túrin's mind fractured under the weight of the revelation. The courage that had slain a dragon was useless against this intimate horror. His world did not just end, it inverted, twisting a sacred bond into a source of ultimate shame and despair. His love for Ninjal, once his salvation, became a memory he could not bear to hold. How do you live when your greatest happiness is revealed as your greatest sin? The question had no answer, only a final, grim resolution. He found Ninjal by the river, herself awakened to the terrible truth and fleeing in blind terror. As he called out to her, she cast herself into the rushing water, choosing death over the unbearable reality. Túrin stood alone on the precipice, the black sword Gurthang still warm with Glaurung's blood. In that moment, he made his last decision. There was no enemy left to fight, no kingdom to save, no family to protect. The curse had systematically dismantled his entire life, and his one act of defiance had only delivered the final, cruelest blow. He turned the point of the sword that had slain the father of dragons against himself. The weapon that had brought down a god now ended the life of the man who wielded it, a final, tragic symmetry in a story written in sorrow. The news traveled not as a single story, but as two. A great victory, the mighty Glaurung was dead, and a great tragedy, the hero Húrin's son was dead by his own hand. The two tales were inseparable, a bitter lesson that in the war against the ultimate darkness, even the most glorious of triumphs could be paid for with a price beyond any gold or glory. The chains that were not iron finally fell away, with Glaurung dead and his cruel purpose of torment complete. Morgoth saw no further use for his prisoner. He released Húrin from his high seat on Thangorodrim, a final act of contempt for the broken, aged man who had witnessed his entire world crumble. This was not a mercy. It was the last turn of the screw, a freedom that was itself the most exquisite form of torture. Húrin walked into a world he no longer recognized, his body bent and his eyes haunted by decades of forced sight. His first and only journey was a pilgrimage of grief, leading him to the stony ravine of Cave Denaris. There he found the cold, scaled husk of the dragon, and nearby, the burial mound of his children. The full, horrific truth of the curse, which he had only watched from a distance, now struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had endured his imprisonment by clinging to the hope that his defiance had meaning, that his family had somehow survived and thrived. That hope was now a pile of stones and a dead monster. The internal conflict was absolute, a storm of grief, rage, and a profound, soul-crushing guilt. How does a father live when his unwavering will has been the anchor for his family's doom? Externally, he was a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own life. The world had moved on. The Great War had continued without him, and the people he met spoke of his son and daughter as figures from a tragic legend, their stories already fading into song. This isolation, this sense of being an unwanted relic from a more sorrowful time, sharpened his bitterness into a weapon. He made a decision fueled by a pain that had no other outlet. He would confront the last great power he believed had failed his family, the elven king Thingol, in the hidden realm of Doriath. He arrived at the gates of the Thousand Caves, not as a returning hero, but as an accuser. He stood before the throne and hurled his grief at the king, blaming him for taking Túrin in and then failing to protect him, for the web of events that led to Nargothrond's fall. His words were not a plea for understanding, but a venomous curse upon the kingdom itself. This single, bitter act sowed one last seed of discord among the free peoples. It turned ally against ally in their final, fragile days, proving that the dragon's poison could outlive its body. Húrin's release brought no closure, only a deeper, more personal understanding of the loss. It demonstrated that defeating the great weapon could not heal the wounds it had inflicted, that the suffering was a legacy that would linger long after the fire had cooled. With nothing left to say, and no one left to accuse, the broken man turned away. His final, sorrowful wanderings took him to the western edges of the world, where the endless sea met the shore. There he stood, a solitary figure against the vast, gray horizon, as the waves crashed and retreated with a rhythm that whispered of endings, and of a final, cataclysmic war gathering its strength just beyond the edge of sight. The endless sorrow of Húrin and the ruin of his house finally broke the long patience of the West. The Valor, the guardians of the world, looked upon Beleriand and saw a land drowning in unbroken grief, a people brought to the brink of annihilation by the cruelty of their fallen brother. They could stand aside no longer. A host was assembled in the undying lands, a force of such immense power that its very march across the ocean caused the seas to boil and the winds to scream. This was not an army of elves or men. This was the host of the Valor, a divine intervention meant to make a final end to Morgoth. The war that followed was not named for a battle or a leader, but for the very emotion it invoked, the War of Wrath. For 42 years, the conflict raged across the northern world, a cataclysm that made all previous battles seem like skirmishes. The ground itself became a weapon. Mountains were thrown down like toys by the combatants, and vast plains were swallowed by the raging sea. The continent of Beleriand, the stage for so many tales of heroism and tragedy, began to crack and sink beneath the unimaginable forces unleashed. For the elves and the Edain who still remained, this intervention presented a terrible, final choice. They could flee south and abandon their ancestral homes to this divine fury, or they could join the fight, committing the last of their strength to a cause that would inevitably destroy the very lands they were fighting to save. It was a decision that tore at the soul. How do you choose to help burn your own house down? Yet for most, the answer was clear. They drew their swords one last time and marched alongside the Maiar and the Vanir elves of Valinor, their hearts heavy with a profound and tragic resolve. They fought not for victory, for that was now assured, but for the right to witness the end, to have a hand in the final downfall of the shadow that had consumed their kin. The stakes of this war were absolute, the ultimate escalation. This was no longer a struggle for kingdoms or freedom, but for the fundamental nature of the world. Victory would mean casting Morgoth out of creation itself into the timeless void, but the price was the complete annihilation of their world, the beautiful, wounded land of Beleriand that held every memory of their lives. In the final, earth-shattering clash before the gates of Angband, the last of the great dragons were unleashed. But even these flying terrors, the winged fire drakes, led by Ankalagan the Black, could not stand before the wrath of the West. Ankalagan, the greatest of his kind, fell from the sky in a ruin of scale and flame, his body crashing upon the triple peaks of Thangorodrim and breaking them asunder. His death shattered the final defense of Morgoth. The reign of the dragons was broken, the survivors driven in terror into the deepest, darkest corners of the world, their age of terror brought to a decisive and permanent end. The war ended not with a cheer, but with a long, weary silence. Morgoth, the source of all shadow, was at last brought in chains before the throne of the Valor. His power was stripped from him, and he was cast through the door of night into the timeless void, an exile from the world he had sought to corrupt. This was the ultimate victory, the final overthrow of the first and greatest enemy. Yet as the divine host departed, the land itself groaned in its death throes. The continent of Beleriand, shattered by the unimaginable fury of the conflict, could bear its own weight no longer. With a roar that drowned out the lament of the survivors, the seas rushed in. The very ground upon which the great kingdoms had stood, the forests where elves had sung, the hills where heroes were buried, all of it broke and sank beneath the churning waves. The victory was absolute, but but the price was the complete and utter annihilation of an entire world. For the survivors, this was a grief beyond any battle lost. They had won, but their homes, their history, the very graves of their loved ones, were now lost to the deep. The elves were presented with a profound choice, a chance to sail west to the undying lands, to leave the mortal world and its endless cycles of sorrow behind. Many, their spirits scarred by the long centuries of war and the fresh horror of the drowning, accepted this grace. They turned their backs on Middle-earth, seeking healing in a land untouched by shadow. Yet others made a different, more difficult decision. They chose to remain, bound by love for the mortal lands, or by a duty to remember what had been lost. This schism would define the nature of elvenkind for ages to come, creating a permanent divide between those who departed and those who lingered. The race of men, the Edain who had fought so valiantly alongside the elves, were granted a reward of their own, a new home. The Valor raised an island from the depths of the sea, far to the west of Middle-earth, and gave it to them. This was Númenor, the land of the gift, a place of peace and unprecedented longevity for its people. This act fundamentally reshaped the world's balance. The elven realms of the First Age were gone, and the power of men was now centered in a mighty seafaring kingdom, setting the stage for a new dynamic between the races. The survivors, both elven and human, now faced the immense internal conflict of grieving a world that no longer existed while being forced to build a new one from the ashes of the old. How do you plant a tree when the soil of your ancestors is at the bottom of the ocean? Their peace was bittersweet, a respite born from absolute cataclysm. With Morgoth gone, a new age began, but it was not an age of unbroken light. His greatest lieutenant, the Maya Sauron, had survived the ruin. He had bowed his head and feigned repentance, hiding his malice to bide his time. The shadow was not destroyed, only dispersed, and its most cunning servant remained at large, a seed of future conflict planted in the fertile ground of a wounded world. The great dragons were broken and scattered, but the memory of Glaurung's cunning and his terrible golden eyes became a legend, then a myth, and finally a whispered warning. As the waves closed forever over the drowned highlands of Dorthonion and the shattered caves of Nargothrond, the stories of the first dragon and the tragic heroism of those who fought him passed from history into song, a haunting echo of a lost world for the ages yet to come. The long peace of the New Age was not a time of forgetting. In the quiet halls of Lindon and the fledgling libraries of Númenor, lore masters and minstrels gathered the fragments of a lost world. They collected the scattered tales of the first dragon and the tragic House of Húrin, stitching them together into a single, somber epic. This was not merely an act of remembrance, but a sacred duty. They were preserving a crucial history and a dire warning, ensuring that future generations would understand the patient, insidious nature of true evil and the profound, personal price required for defiance. The story became a foundational text, a dark mirror held up to the world, reminding all that victory could be as bitter as defeat. The legacy of the worm was therefore a thing of profound conflict, a heritage of both blazing inspiration and chilling caution. Listeners would feel their spirits soar at the courage of Glorfindel and the raw defiance of Húrin, only to have their hearts broken by the inexorable tragedy of Túrin. This complex, painful truth was the very core of the lesson. The keepers of the lore faced a difficult decision. They could have softened the edges, turned the story into a simpler tale of good triumphing over evil. But they chose instead to preserve the full, unvarnished horror. They ensured that every future king and every would-be hero would understand that darkness could not be defeated by strength alone, that it often demanded a sacrifice that scarred the soul itself. The stakes for this accurate preservation were immense. To forget the true cost, to sanitize the suffering, would be to risk everything. A generation that only remembered the slaying of the dragon, but not the ruin that followed, would be doomed. They would march blindly into their own conflicts, expecting clean victories and glorious endings, utterly unprepared for the cunning and psychological warfare that a truly intelligent evil could wield. The correct understanding of this legacy became a shield for the future. These carefully kept tales were passed down through the long, quiet years, sung by firesides and studied by scholars, a deep and resonant echo from a drowned world. They lay waiting in the collective memory of elves and men, a reservoir of grim wisdom, for the day when the shadows would once again lengthen and the world would have desperate need of their hard-learned lessons. In the lightless, water-choked halls of a sunken kingdom, a final judgment was passed. The Valor, in their profound pity and unyielding justice, looked upon the tormented spirit of Túrin Turambar. His long suffering, born from a curse he never deserved, had finally reached its terminus. They granted him a release unique in the history of the world, a mercy beyond the circles of Arda. His spirit, so long chained to a legacy of sorrow, was allowed to depart. His heroic defiance and tragic flaws weighed and remembered, but his endless pain, at last, brought to a close. This was not a simple erasure, but a healing, an acknowledgement that even the most broken of heroes could find peace beyond the confines of a story written in grief. Simultaneously, in the timeless void beyond the door of night, a different fate unfolded for the architect of that grief. The malevolent spirit of Glaurung, the father of dragons, did not merely linger in exile. The foundational power that Morgoth had poured into his first and greatest weapon was irrevocably broken. The cunning intelligence that had haunted the dreams of elves and men, the ancient malice that had orchestrated the fall of kingdoms and the ruin of a house, was utterly and forever extinguished. It was an unmaking, a final silence imposed upon a being whose entire existence had been a scream of hatred against the world. This dual resolution represents the ultimate closure of their terrible conflict. The weapon and its greatest victim were both freed from their binding dance of destruction, one through an act of divine compassion, the other through absolute, final nullification. The long, bitter war between them, which had spilled from the open plains into the most intimate corners of the heart, was over. What does such an ending truly mean for the world they left behind? It signifies that no shadow, no matter how ancient or deeply woven into fate, is truly permanent, and it affirms that no sacrifice, no matter how shrouded in tragedy, is ever entirely forgotten by the powers that govern the universe. The story of the first dragon concludes not with a triumphant cheer, but with this profound, resonant quiet, a silence that speaks of costs finally paid and balances finally restored. The world they knew was truly gone, drowned beneath a remade sea, its very geography a testament to the terrible price of victory. From the ashes of that cataclysm, new kingdoms rose under new stars, their foundations built upon the hard-learned lessons of the past. The elves, their numbers diminished and their spirits tempered by loss, carried the memory of the lost realms into their new homes in Lindon and the hidden valleys, their songs now tinged with a sorrowful wisdom. The race of men, elevated to the glory of Númenor, stepped into their prominence, forever marked by the defiance of Húrin and the tragedy of his son, a constant reminder of the perils of pride and the cruel designs of fate. These were not just stories told for comfort by the fire. They were the very bedrock of their new identities, the myths that explained who they were and what they had survived. The legend of Glorfindel's selfless light, of Húrin's unbroken will upon his stony throne, and of Túrin's doomed, furious struggle became more than history. They became a moral compass for the ages. They taught a difficult, essential truth, that the greatest darkness must be met with courage, but that such courage rarely leads to a clean, happy ending. The cost is counted in shattered families, sunken homelands, and heroes broken upon the wheel of their own virtues. This is the profound legacy of the first dragon. The immediate shadow of Morgoth was lifted, his physical presence cast into the void, but the memory of Glaurung's cunning and his world-ending fire was seared into the soul of every free people. It became an eternal reminder, a watchword passed from parent to child, that vigilance is the price of peace. The world had been saved not by a single glorious battle, but through a long, agonizing tapestry of individual choices, each act of defiance, a thread woven against the encroaching dark. This legacy, born from fire and grief, would now guide the hands of kings and the hearts of common folk in the ages yet to come, a somber light to steer by when new shadows would inevitably begin to stir.